All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab Spatial Data Science Seminar Series. My name is Ian Breckheimer, and I'm a research scientist at Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And I'm really excited today to talk about point clouds. In particular, what can we do with all this point cloud data that we're getting from LiDAR and UAV photogrammetry to measure the 3D structure of ecosystems and something about their function. Before I get into that, though, I really want to emphasize that this is part of a series. We're about 2/3 of the way through. This is 4 of 6 planned webinars. Next March, I guess this March in a month, we're going to be talking about really linking field data with remote sensing for spatial prediction. And that'll be kind of bringing together a lot of the topics we've talked about in previous webinars. And then in April, I'm going to talk about some of the data products that I'm generating for people who work at Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. Those will also be kind of interesting for non-Rumble related folks to just see what's possible with all these new remote sensing tools. But today, we're all about point clouds. So the outline of my talk is basically going to follow the why, what, and how format of the previous webinars. And the topics I'm going to cover are really, why is this a good time to get comfortable with point cloud data? What are the basic properties of point clouds and how are we deriving them from different sensor technologies? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the 2 main technologies we're using? That's structure from motion photogrammetry and LiDAR. Those are both ways of getting really useful point cloud data, but they have different strengths and weaknesses. Next, I'm going to talk about what the core workflows that we need to employ to boil all this complex data down into really useful information are in environmental science. And I'm going to focus on the workflows that are pretty well established and scalable. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about what's coming in terms of the cutting edge workflows that what we expect to be more common in the future as these methods continue to develop. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own work, and that's using LiDAR point clouds, actually repeat LiDAR data to monitor forest dynamics and mortality in Western Colorado. It's a cool project. And then I'm going to do a demo of processing point clouds in some open source tools, Cloud Compare, and an R package called LiDAR, LIDR. And I think the lecture style is going to take probably 30 or 40 minutes, and then the interactive, again, 30 or 40 minutes. I'm really going to try and emphasize the interactive stuff this time, because there's just like a lot of really cool, visually striking things that we can do with point clouds. All right, but let's get started. First of all, before we talk about what are point clouds? This is an example of one. This is a rail corridor in Germany. And every single one of those little colored dots is just a single point that's located in 3-dimensional space. So it's a point that's assumed to have no kind of spatial dimensions. It doesn't have a size, but it does have an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate, which allows us to make this 3D plot. And it also has attributes associated with that point, which are represented by the different colors. So the rainbow color scheme that's coming up next, right here, is height above the ground. You also have various measures of spectral characteristics of the point. And I think in there is also a classification of overhead wires and trees and railroad tracks and things like that. So this is a point cloud. These are now sort of everywhere, but why should we worry about them for environmental biology, for ecology? And that's because 3D structure matters for nature, matters for ecosystems. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different examples. First of all, one of my favorites from the southeastern United States. This is the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is a federally endangered species that has very, very picky habitat requirements. So it is only found in sparse, open, longleaf pine savannas in the southeastern United States. And these ecosystems and the structure, the 3D structure of those woodlands are really maintained by regular fire. And if you don't have regular fire, then a very different 3-dimensional structure of forest grows up. You have understory of oaks and bays and all these less fire adapted plants that grow up, and woodpeckers really don't like those structures of forests. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. military, and other land management agencies that have woodpeckers, red-headed woodpeckers on their properties use LiDAR regularly to measure the three-dimensional structure of their forests and make sure that it's up to spec in terms of the quality of habitat for woodpeckers. But even if you're not a big fan of charismatic wildlife, 3D structure matters for ecosystems for other sort of functional reasons as well. And that is that the three-dimensional structure of a forest or other plant community determines how much light it can capture, how much carbon it can fix, how much water it can transpire. And if we want to measure that accurately, if we want to estimate that accurately, we have to understand something about the three-dimensional structure. So a lot of that hinges on this property of ecosystems called leaf area index, or LAI. The traditional way that we've measured LAI is from ground-based hemispherical photography. So this is an example of six, actually I think this is from a simulation study. So these are 6 simulated hemispherical photographs. These are essentially just pointed up at the vegetation canopy. And if you only have this sort of 2-dimensional information, you can do a moderately good job of predicting leaf area index. But if you pair this with 3-dimensional structure data from point clouds, then you can do a really good job of estimating leaf area index. And by point, also important functional properties of ecosystems, like how much they transpire, how much carbon they fix, et cetera. So 3D structure matters. There's also it's important to pay attention to point clouds right now, because there are a bunch of new platforms and sensors, and it's becoming very cheap to collect point cloud data. I went into the history of LiDAR a little bit to pull out, so how did this develop? And it turns out that it actually developed from laser range finding technology that was developed in the 1950s and early 1960s, and then was employed actually on Apollo 15 for the first time for terrain mapping. So this is the Apollo 15 orbiter that has a laser that's actually, you can kind of see it on the side of the instrument right here next to one of the attitude thrusters. And that was used to map the topography of the moon. Of course, it was a pretty crude instrument there. It could only tell the difference between, I guess the distance between the orbiter and the surface. It didn't have any kind of scanning capability. And over the next a couple of decades, that laser range finding technology got combined with some really kind of basic engineering advances. So they decided to put this laser rangefinder next to a rotating mirror. And that allowed, instead of just getting the point, I guess the range to a single point, this allowed a laser rangefinder to actually scan an environment and collect multiple points in a given interval of time. And if you combine that with very sensitive gyroscopes that can figure out what the orientation of the laser and the mirror are, very accurate positioning, so we understand exactly where the laser is and where the detector is, it turns out that this is a very powerful scanning technology. And LiDAR first became used really for environmental purposes in the 1990s and early 2000s, when they started to mount these on airplanes. And the first big application was mapping terrain. So, if you have a laser scanner on an airplane, you can cover very large landscapes and very accurately determine the elevation of the ground surface. And that is super important for flood management, for landslide mitigation, for all sorts of purposes. Now, fast forward 20 or 30 years, and all of this machinery has been miniaturized, and now we've been able to get rid of the spinning laser. So this is iPhone 12 Pro Max. This is a smartphone that was released last year. It was the first commercial smartphone to incorporate a LiDAR sensor into the camera array. So the little gray dot that's sort of south of the flash on this camera array is a tiny little solid state LiDAR sensor that has a couple hundred lasers that are almost microscopic, and they shine light out through a diffraction grating and receive light from reflections. And it's able to do all the things that that sort of spinning mirror rangefinder did, except it's able to do it much faster and much cheaper. This this LiDAR probably costs Apple about $200. You can sort of contrast that to the first LiDAR on the left-hand side, which was literally a moonshot. Okay, so that's not the most important or most exciting recent advance in LiDAR technology, although we've got now these solid state LiDARs that we can put on drones, we can put on cars, and that allows us to collect all kinds of point cloud data in interesting and new ways. No, the most exciting platform and sensor package is that's come up recently for environmental biologists is something called JEDI. So this is an example of JEDI data, actually from longleaf pine forests in the southeastern United States, from South Carolina. And JEDI, like a lot of other LiDAR instruments, is really good at measuring forest structure. But the thing that's unique about JEDI is that it's able to do that globally because it's mounted on the International Space Station. So this instrument shines a pretty powerful laser all the way through the atmosphere from about 70 miles up in space. And the detector that's in the center of that frame is an incredibly sensitive photodetector that can quantify individual photons that are from the laser that are pass all the way through the atmosphere. They bounce off of the ground surface or vegetation. And they return to this photodetector that's attached to a telescope. And this is just remarkable. In a lot of ways, it's similar to that Apollo rangefinder mission on the moon, and it doesn't actually scan much of the surface. I think it'll take about 5 years or so to map all of the world's forests. And it also doesn't collect as detailed a data as some of the other LiDAR methods. But this is just remarkable. We've got now point cloud data that encompasses the entire globe, or soon will. And I also wanted to mention is that they're unusually good on social media, the JEDI crew, and they're not without a sense of humor, which I appreciate. This is one of their marketing GIFs. All right, but this is not all just about LiDAR. In the last 10 years or so, we've also got the capability to collect point cloud data using another technique that does not rely on laser scanning like LiDAR does, and that's structure from motion photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is just measurements from images, and structure from motion just means that we're able to reconstruct three-dimensional scenes if we have lots and lots of images taken from different angles. And that results in point clouds that are in some ways are really similar to the clouds that we can get from LiDAR. But importantly, the quality and quantity of points that we can get from that technique depends a lot on how much overlap, how many overlapping images we have that allows the computer to reconstruct point clouds. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this works later in my talk. But for now, just know that we now have a whole plethora of ways of collecting point cloud data, and they range anywhere from an iPhone to a consumer drone to a LiDAR that's based on a UAV or an airplane, all the way to a LiDAR that's based in space. And all of these data streams are accumulating at a rapid rate, and we can do really cool things with them. Okay, so that's why. Now let's just talk about the basic properties of point clouds and how they're derived. And I'm going to talk about, in particular, the structure of the data, and then I'm going to give you two little vignettes in terms of how the processing works on both the LiDAR side and the photogrammetry side. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this. You could read and write whole books about the processes going on under the hood in some of the software here, but I'm just going to sketch the outlines so that you understand how this data comes to us, essentially. So the typical structure of a point cloud data set is actually really simple. There's a lot of complexity on the technology side in terms of how to set up these systems, but when the data comes to us, typically it's essentially just a gigantic data table with three-dimensional points. So this is an example of just 6 points at the header of one of the files that, that I uploaded as an example for this webinar. And it's just X, Y, and Z. These are projected coordinates, so we have to know what coordinate system we're working in. They're not latitude and longitude, but they're just X, Y, and Z, and they're all measured in meters, so that's convenient. Most point cloud datasets also have other attributes that are associated with them, but exactly what those attributes are depends on the method that the data was derived from. So this is a LiDAR point cloud, and so it has a couple of other attributes that are specifically associated with the LiDAR collection method, like return number and intensity, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the important thing is that all of these are able to be encompassed by a couple of simple standard formats. The most important one is called LAS, which is an open standard that's been around for actually almost 20 years for describing and documenting and holding LiDAR data. And that's either as a .las file or sometimes as a compressed LAZ file. These data, they're simple in structure, but they have some challenges. They are almost always really, really big. And we're talking gigabytes to terabytes. And that poses a couple of different challenges. And they're sometimes messy. And by messy, what I mean is that not all of the points that are in our data set are actually valid data. There's some noise here. And then there's some data sets are messier than others. And I'll talk a little bit about the mess in a minute. But first of all, like how do we get here? How do we get to this sort of tabular data format? And there are really two ways. One is LiDAR, and the second is photogrammetry. And I'll talk about LiDAR a little bit first. So just like we were talking about before, this is based on hitting a target with a laser, essentially. So if you imagine this laser mounted on an airplane or a UAV, it's got some beam that comes down, and it's recording the time that the pulse was emitted. And then it's got a detector that records the amplitude of returned energy at that same wavelength. And it can use the time of flight, the difference in time between the emitted pulse and the returned energy, to estimate the range of that pulse. Essentially, just like multiply the time of flight by the speed of light, and you've got the range. I think that's kind of cool. So this comes back to the detector as essentially what's called a waveform. And so this plot on the left-hand side shows what that waveform looks like. It's just amplitude versus time. And what the detector typically does is it discretizes that waveform. So it takes the peaks, and it doesn't record the full, the full data stream that comes back. Instead, it just says, okay, this is when the first return happened, and this is when the last return happened. And it'll record the precise time and then calculate the distance and the three-dimensional position of that point. And that's pretty important, because we actually have information here that is more than just this is where the point is in space. We also know which laser pulse it was associated with, and whether it was the first return, the last return, or something in between. So the first return is likely to represent like the top of whatever object we're looking at, like a tree, and the last return is likely to represent the ground. And that's going to be really important for classification purposes later. For photogrammetry, we actually have a totally different system. So LiDAR is an active remote sensing system, right? It is sending energy from a laser to the surface, and it's getting energy back, and it's interpreting that. Photogrammetry just relies on passive radiation that's coming to a sensor, essentially just photographs. But if you have enough of those photographs that contain common distinctive points, then you can reconstruct the full 3D geometry of a scene. But that relies on what are called tie points. So in this graphic, Q1 and Q2 are distinctive points that are visible in all three of the images. And if a computer can learn to identify what point in each image represents Q1 and Q2, then it can use trigonometry to figure out what the, I guess, what the dimensions of all of the triangles in the scene are. It can reconstruct essentially the full 3D geometry of the scene if it has enough of those tie points. There is a lot that goes into structure for motion photogrammetry processing, and I'm going to skip over most of it. But the important things that I wanted to emphasize are that the quality of the reconstruction that we get depends on the density of tie points that the computer can recognize in adjacent images. And so if a scene is full of really distinctive stuff, then that reconstruction is going to go really smoothly. But if you've got really smooth surfaces like snow that don't have many features, or if you've got surfaces that have a lot of repetitive elements like leaves that all look about the same, then that reconstruction is going to have a lower quality. You're going to get more geometric errors, and you're going to get lower density of points. So despite this limitation, though, this actually works really well as long as you have enough views from different angles of the same scene. Okay. So those are the two main ways that we get point cloud data: LiDAR, structure for motion photogrammetry. What are the strengths and weaknesses of those two different strategies? So I'm going to go through some of these strengths and weaknesses, and then I'm going to show you the data, because I think this is probably the best way to go forward, is to actually like show you some of the differences here. But let's just go through them really fast. So LiDAR has some advantages here. So you get relatively uniform sampling. If your LiDAR is set up as a scanner, then it's essentially sampling the landscape at a particular spacing. And sometimes that spacing can be farther apart or closer together, but it's relatively uniform within a swath or a flight line. And you also get constant, relatively high spatial precision for the points that come back, on the order of centimeters. So as long as the GPS in the airplane is working really well, and the high precision clock that it's using to calculate time of flight is working really well, then you're getting constant high spatial precision. The laser, depending on the wavelength of the laser, it can sometimes penetrate vegetation quite well. These are typically near infrared or green lasers, which actually do reflect quite well off of vegetation surfaces. But the footprint on the ground of a lot of these systems is on the order of about the size of a dinner plate. So even in relatively dense forests, there are little gaps that allow some of that energy to pass all the way down to the ground surface and all the way back down back up to the sensor, as long as vegetation is not too dense. And then you also get these rich spatial attributes. I was talking earlier about the return number. So we can differentiate between the returns that were the first to come back to the sensor from a given laser pulse versus the returns that came back later. And then that's going to be really important for classifying point cloud data. Unfortunately, LiDAR equipment is still pretty expensive. The low-cost LiDAR sensor that's on an iPhone comes at a cost of precision, and then of course you got to figure out how to move the sensor around to all the different places that you want to take data. The airplane-based and drone-based LiDAR sensors are still relatively expensive. The other thing that's, I think, a limitation of LiDAR is that you don't get much spectral information about each point. Because lasers by definition emit light at a single wavelength, you're only getting information on that single wavelength back. Whereas some of the photogrammetry methods allow us to get more spectral information. And you put all that stuff together, and LiDAR tends to have a lower density of spatial points than photogrammetry does. And I'll preface that by saying that's airborne LiDAR. There are also terrestrial laser scanners that can produce very, very dense point clouds. But those are typically only used for relatively small areas, whereas airborne LiDAR can scan very, very large landscapes. So photogrammetry has some advantages too. Usually it's going to give you higher point density, even up to hundreds of points per square meter. It also gives you really rich spectral information. So even with ordinary RGB photos, you're now getting not only X, Y, and Z coordinates of where that point is in space, but also red, green, and blue information that indicates how bright a pixel is in all those different wavelengths. And if you're using an even fancier camera, like a multispectral camera that can see into the infrared, you might even get 5 or 6 or 7 spectral bands associated with each point. The equipment is relatively inexpensive, at least compared to LiDAR. There is a lot that you can do just by strapping an ordinary RGB camera onto a drone and flying it around. And it also allows you to be flexible in your deployment, right? Because you just need a relatively low-cost equipment, you can decide when you want to go out and collect data. You don't have to contract a firm 6 months in advance to scan your site for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Unfortunately, the point clouds that you get back from photogrammetry have some downsides to them. The first one is that the precision and density of those clouds isn't constant across the scene. And the important thing there is that the density and precision depends on how many easily identifiable points are in the scene. So if you've got smooth surfaces that don't have much definition, you're not going to get as many points back. Similarly, if you've got really complex geometries that the structure for motion methods have trouble reconstructing, then you're going to have lower point density. The processing for photogrammetry data is pretty intensive. So for a typical drone-based photogrammetry survey that we do, that takes several hours of processing on a pretty powerful workstation with a couple of graphics processing units in it. So if we're going to use cloud computing for this, like we sometimes do for really big projects, those costs can add up. So it's sort of cheap on the acquisition end, but then expensive on the processing side. And the last thing is it doesn't sort of penetrate dense vegetation as well as laser does. And I put penetrate in quotation marks there because in reality, it's not there's nothing to penetrate, right? It's using passive light. And so if the understory of dense vegetation is really dark and it's obscured from many of the photos, then it's just going to end up as sort of gaps or errors in those photogrammetry point clouds. Okay, so that's the sort of, let me talk you through these different pros and cons. Let's actually take a look at these clouds and see what we're dealing with here. And in particular, I'm going to contrast a couple of one LiDAR data set that's actually a really high quality one from my domain. This is essentially top of the line modern solid state LiDAR sensor that's mounted on an airplane, collecting data from August to September of 2019. This is actually a gigantic data set. Covers all of Gunnison County, which is essentially the size of Connecticut, with a density of about 14 points per meter squared, which is pretty good for an airborne LiDAR data set. And I'm going to contrast that with a structure from motion photogrammetry point cloud that I collected using a Mavic 2 Pro in Western Colorado. So this was data collection was done July 11th, 2020. We processed about 804 images. They have about a 3 centimeter ground sample distance. So we get essentially 3 centimeter resolution on our point clouds. We processed that with photogrammetry software, Agisoft Metashape. And the full cloud there is not quite as big as the full data set for the airborne LiDAR, but it's much denser. So the original data is 306 points per meter squared. And the data I'm actually going to demo is downsampled. I think we're only going to show you something that's about 50 points per meter squared because it performs a little bit better for processing and visualization. I didn't want to murder anybody's laptop as they try and build a visualization. Okay, so those are the 2 point clouds. Let's take a look at what they look like. First of all, to get oriented, I want to show you where we're, oops. Sorry, had a little bit of a screen sharing fail there. Cool. So let's get oriented. So I want to go out from, this is the Colorado Rockies, and we're going to zoom in to the Gunnison Basin. This is where I live down in the city of Gunnison. We're going to zoom all the way down into Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. You can see Gothic Mountain up here to the west. And I'm going to show you guys a point cloud from this tiny little corner of Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. So it's a tile that's 250 by 250 meters, and is, you know, I think it's interesting because it has a bunch of different vegetation types, and it's got some structures and other cool things to look at. And also just is a good example of the strengths and weaknesses of those different point cloud methods. All right, so let's take a look at what these look like. I'm actually going to switch over to a workstation that has a better graphics card than my laptop does. Okay, so this is Cloud Compare, which is a free and open source point cloud visualization and processing software. It's been around for a while, and it's stable. It performs really well, and it has a ton of plugins and tools. So I use it a lot to kind of explore point cloud data, particularly large point clouds that have trouble visualizing using other tools like R. So I've loaded those two point clouds into Cloud Compare. If you download the files associated with the webinar series, you'll see a couple of folders in the data folder for this webinar, and these point clouds are in with that. So if you wanted to load them yourself, you can. So let's look at the structure for motion point cloud first, right? So this is this kind of almost looks like a photograph. This is I've colored the points by their red, green, and blue values, but it's a photograph that you can zoom in and out of and play with in three-dimensional space. This is pretty remarkable, right? But you'll notice that there are some holes, particularly associated with this dense vegetation here. So it turns out that when I flew the drone to take the images that this point cloud was derived from, I only had about 75% overlap between adjacent images. And that means that there weren't many images that saw in between the trees into these really dark shadowed environments. And then that meant when we get through with photogrammetry processing, we've got some gaps there. And so that means that, you know, I've got fantastically detailed information in some respects. I think if I were to really zoom in here, I could probably read David Inouye's license plate. Maybe not quite that good, close. But I have almost no information from the dense forest understory here. And I can actually show you, if we sort of get rid of the vegetation points, I'll go into how we did this in a second. I'm just going to turn off the vegetation. So these are the points that are really close to the ground. And you can see that there's like all sorts of detail in the non-forested regions. But if you look at that, I just have like very, very little information from the forest understory. There are a few patches where I've got points, and these are associated with canopy gaps, but we're really, we're really pushing it here. So let's contrast that with what a LiDAR point cloud looks like. So I'm going to just turn that on. And you'll notice that it looks kind of ghostly. And the reason is that this is substantially less dense a point cloud than the structure for motion approach. So if I zoom in, you can actually see the space in between the points. And you can kind of see the scan lines that the laser used as it scanned across the scene. So that's got some downsides. We don't quite have as much detailed vegetation information in the non-forested environments. But let's take a look at what we have on the ground surface here. So I did the same kind of classification that we did before. You can see there are some holes where we've got trees that are too dense to get penetrated by the laser scan. But we've got substantially more information in the understory in the LiDAR point cloud than we do in the structure for motion point cloud. So I'll just turn that SFM point cloud back on. So you can see, so that's structure for motion, and that's LiDAR. So this makes a really big difference if we care a ton about topography, right? So if we're trying to map fine scale topography in really dense vegetated environments, that's going to be really, really difficult to do well using structure for motion photogrammetry. But if we have LiDAR that's dense enough, then even in situations where we've got really dense vegetation, we're going to be able to get a good sense of what the topography is. Anyway, so that is the that's the kind of show and tell side of things. So like we boil this down, if we really care about topography, go with LiDAR. If we really care about the spectral properties of the surface of things, in this case, say if we wanted to classify individual trees or individual shrubs, then structure for motion photogrammetry would probably be a better choice. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of point clouds. What are the core workflows that we want to go through here? And essentially, like, how do we take this mess and extract useful information from it? And there are, I think, a couple of important steps that we almost always want to do with point cloud data. And one of those is terrain classification. We want to figure out where the ground is. What's the surface that all of these points are essentially resting on? And that's I think a tricky and kind of a surprisingly subjective process. There's a reason why they call a digital elevation model a model, because it turns out that ground surfaces, especially at very high resolutions, aren't very smooth. And so you have to make decisions on really funny questions like, you know, if there's a rock that sticks out of the surface, is that part of the surface or is it not? Anyway, that's sort of these terrain classification and DEM generation methods. Next, a lot of times what we want to do is normalize the point cloud by the terrain. And what I mean by that is that we can subtract the elevation of the ground surface from this point cloud. And that means that the Z coordinate is no longer elevation above sea level, but is now elevation above the ground surface. And that's going to be really important if we want to, say, quantify the height of the trees in a scene. First, we want to get rid of the ground elevation so that the point cloud represents the height of vegetation or other objects that are attached to the ground. Next, we want to find and measure the canopy surface, right? So for the most part, if we're interested, say, in the height of trees, what we want to do is not really focus on where the bulk of the points are, but rather where the points stop, as at the maximum elevations at which you have points. So there's a bunch of methods associated with finding that canopy surface. And we want to oftentimes extract gridded measures of topography and vegetation from this data. So if you're interested in, say, habitat quality for red-cockaded woodpeckers, you're not really interested in the individual tree scale. What you want to do is look across a forest stand and summarize it in a way that makes sense for the habitat management objective that you're interested in. So say you don't necessarily care about individual trees, but you want to know what's the overall understory cover in this patch of forest. And those are the kinds of gridded metrics that you can extract using the methods that we'll talk about. And then finally, and this is actually something that's happening more and more with point cloud data, is that instead of gridding and summarizing the data, we're actually delineating objects in it and extracting information directly from those objects. So an example of that would be to segment a point cloud into individual trees, here represented by kind of cartoon segmentations of different colors. And then once we have those objects delineated, then we can measure them. So if we wanted to figure out what the height of all those trees were, or what the coordinates of the tree tops were, that's an example of measurements that are pretty straightforward to generate using point cloud data. Okay, so all of these steps are kind of core point cloud workflows that have been used for LiDAR data for more than a decade, and for structure for motion point clouds for almost a decade. And so there's sort of a set of tools that are fairly mature and they're fairly fast that allows us to move forward with extracting useful information from point clouds. It's not all rosy, however. Unfortunately, there are some pain points here. Oops. Wow, yeah, I think I need to reshare my screen. There we go. So there are some common pain points in these workflows. The first is that a lot of these workflows are based on proprietary algorithms and software. So at least up until recently, you sort of had a choice to go with the open source stuff, which was kind of limited, and then use a bunch of proprietary software that was more advanced, but wasn't as reproducible, and that's not good news for science. It's sort of a black box problem. Luckily, that workflow has gotten, or sorry, that pain point has gotten better. So now we have high quality open source tools for processing point clouds and extracting vegetation information that allows us to do that in a reproducible way. There is I think a persistent problem is that for point cloud workflows to get good performance, essentially like to get good quality scientific summaries back from point clouds, often requires a lot of dataset specific tweaking. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the demo, but this tweaking process just means that it's time consuming and it's not really easy to transfer a workflow from one type of ecosystem to another, one type of forest to another. And it just requires a lot of tuning to get stuff that works well. And then finally, this is just really big data. So regardless of what your workflow is or what your algorithms are, they have to be really fast in order for the methods to be scalable. And it's sort of like the drinking from the fire hose problem, right? You've got to have quite a bit of computing and storage to get things to go. And then you're restricted in terms of the algorithms that you can apply to the ones that will be fast enough to apply at a large scale. And so these are sort of pain points that are persistent. They're not impossible to overcome. And some of the demos, I'll talk about some of the ways in which we're doing that in the workflow that I'll demo today. But they're just things to be aware of. So I think that it's worthwhile taking a second to talk a little bit about where this is going, right? So we have this sort of core set of workflows where the tools are pretty well developed, but this is a technology that's moving very, very quickly. And if I look 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, it's not out of the question that we're going to have fully automated pre-processing, clustering, segmentation, feature extraction at scale, essentially solved. And the reason why I think that that's possible is that there's a huge market for those technologies. And it's not driven by environmental biology, it's driven by self-driving cars, right? So all of these technologies are super useful for helping robots, including self-driving cars, navigate their environment. So this is an animation of LiDAR data that comes back from a set of scanners that's mounted on a car. You don't actually see the car in the middle of the frame. It's a black blank spot. But this is an algorithm that automatically detects and tracks individual other cars from the point cloud. And it's doing so very, very accurately and very, very quickly. These algorithms and the specific algorithms and the sort of the classes of algorithms are also going to be useful for delineating objects that might be of interest to environmental scientists, like trees, like wildlife. And so these technologies are just advancing very quickly. Unfortunately, this market, again, is dominated by black box proprietary algorithms because there's a lot of money to be made in self-driving cars, potentially, maybe someday. There aren't a ton of yeah, like people are really drilling down on those specific applications. There are some of those algorithms are open source, but not a lot. And it'll take a while for this stuff to filter back into our world. But regardless, I want to talk a little about some projects that I think are exciting that are on the horizon that are applying some of this technology back in our domain. The first one I'll talk about is TreeSeg. And that's a really innovative way of segmenting dense point clouds to extract individual trees, including modeling fitting and modeling the trunk from dense LiDAR data. Unfortunately, it's not quite performant enough to work at really large scales. It's still something that I would say is feasible if you've got a small scene, but really hard to scale up. PointNet is a deep learning algorithm for classifying and clustering and classifying points directly. And that's starting to be used for forestry applications. This is a recent paper that I think was the first one to use PointNet for this particular purpose. But again, these are pretty computationally intensive algorithms, so they're feasible at for small point clouds, but not necessarily for the kind of wall-to-wall processing that we want to do nowadays. The last one that I want to talk about is actually a project called ID Trees, and that's I think a really exciting project to develop scalable training data, field data, remote sensing data for accelerating the development of algorithms for extracting environmental information from point clouds and from imagery. So they're using data from the National Ecological Observatory Network, this is remote sensing data, field data, and they've put it together into a set of training data sets that you can use to optimize algorithms for doing that metric extraction, individual tree segmentation. And they're also hosting, I think this is really innovative, they're hosting a set of data science competitions that pit different teams against each other for the accolades of being the best tree segmenter team. I don't think there's a cash reward for these competitions, although I would have to double check. They may have upped the ante for the next round. So they ran one last year, and for each of the rounds of ID Trees, they actually publish a couple of papers. The top performing teams publish methods papers about what they did to do their best on this data set. So if you want to know sort of where the cutting edge is in terms of extracting information from point clouds or point clouds plus imagery data, because there's an aspect of the competition that's focused on imagery as well. It's a great way to get a sense of what the cutting edge is like figure out who's beating or who's winning in these data science competitions. And there's a ton of information up there on idtrees.org. Cool project run out of the lab at the University of Florida. Okay. So that's sort of the view to the future, but let's go back to the present. Let's talk about how we can leverage these data sets now. And I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about one of my ongoing projects, which I'm super excited about, and that's actually mapping quaking aspen mortality using repeat LiDAR. So I work in Western Colorado, and aspen is in trouble in the West, and in Colorado in particular. There is a syndrome that affects aspen called sudden aspen decline, which has a wonderful acronym SAD. So this is an example of a SAD aspen stand. You can see the canopies of these trees are starting to thin out, and there are some stems here that have died. Interestingly, aspen is clonal, so there's a good chance that all of these individual stems are a single genetic individual. But regardless, this genetic individual is not doing very well. And there's some remote sensing studies that have indicated that aspens declined by as much as 15% in the Western United States since 2000, when this syndrome was identified. And a bunch of different mechanisms probably are involved in sudden aspen decline. It has probably something to do with both drought stress and pathogens, but we're still not really sure exactly how those interact and how they interact with plant genotype and other sort of factors that would affect whether this is likely to continue to get worse, or whether we've sort of seen the worst of it and the stands that are left are likely to be resilient. So what we're trying to do is actually predict sudden aspen decline at individual crown scales across large landscapes. And the only way that we know how to do this is with point cloud data. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about that workflow and what we're going for there. Okay, so in my domain in Western Colorado, we're really lucky that we had two really high quality LiDAR scans that were done of the Upper Gunnison Basin about 5 years apart, one in 2015 and the other one in 2019. And those point clouds have very similar properties. So the 2 point clouds are here on the bottom. The bright green represents tall canopies. The dark blue represents short canopies. And if we process this data well and we come up with really good canopy height estimates across the whole domain, then what we can do is actually just subtract the 2015 from 2019 canopy heights to get a relative change of canopy height between those two scans. And that's what you see on the right here. We've got the difference between the 2019 and 2019 canopy heights, highlighting places where individual crowns have died, have either totally died or just been fallen over or defoliated. And this is now our response variable, right? So we now have a map of where all of the aspen crowns in our region that died between 2015 and 2019, where exactly they were. And we can also tell something about what attributes they had in 2015 before they died. And so that's where we are now, as we're trying to put this data together into a predictive model to predict aspen mortality based on landscape position and other things we can tell about their condition, including their genotype. But that's sort of like still early stages with this. We're just like really excited that we have reliable maps of canopy change. So I'm just gonna really quickly shift over to showing you some of that data. And this is that same part of the landscape that we were looking at before. But I'm going to turn on the canopy height change layer. The color scheme is a little bit different than we were looking at in the figure, but we're still looking at individual crowns that died between 2015 and 2019, represented as red splotches on this landscape. So you can see that kind of scattered aspen mortality, but it's more common in some places than others. Like this stand, for example, has undergone a pretty significant decline over the past 5 years, whereas some other aspen stands don't. We can also see other disturbance agents acting in this landscape as well. So in particular, this red stripe here is the aftermath of an avalanche that happened in March of 2019. So if I turn the map off, you can actually see these are the trunks of the trees that got flattened by hundreds of or thousands of tons of ice and snow rocketing down this hillside at about 80 miles an hour. So it's cool to see all those different processes represented on the landscape. And if I zoom out, we have these estimates for a very large study area. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of aspen trees and tens of thousands of mortality events that we can use to build that predictive model. So stay tuned. I'm really excited to see where this goes. That's just one example of what you can do with point cloud data. All right, so I'm going to go into the interactive demo part of this now, but I did, yeah, before I get to that interactive demo, I wanted to pause and take a few questions. So please add those to the chat, and I should be able to address them. All right, looks like we don't have any questions right now. So I'm going to get on to the demo. All right, so we demoed Cloud Compare earlier, which was a really great software for exploring small point clouds. But if we want to do any kind of larger scale processing, we need to do that with programming tools, with a script. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it boils a complex workflow down into something that's reproducible. And it also allows us to process large numbers of files with the same workflow. So if we had to sort of point and click to process our data, then by the time we got through the fifth LiDAR tile or the fifth tile of point data from photogrammetry, we would be really tired and also try and probably make mistakes in the workflow. So if we script it, we can be we can sort of have good scientific practice, and it also unlocks a ton of tools that are available in different packages. And the most important one that we're going to deal with is one called LiDAR, and it's written primarily by Canadian researcher Jean Romain, I think Roussel is his last name. And luckily, he's actually put together a really great package, but he also put together really great documentation. So there's an ebook, which is linked to in the PowerPoint, that really gives us a ton of great information, far beyond what I'm going to be able to do in this demo. So I'm going to start this off by loading some libraries. That LiDAR package here is one that we're going to use for the core of the processing. But there are a couple of others. The raster package we've used before to visualize gridded data. Our GDAL is a package for reading and writing spatial data. Another one, SF, is a reading and writing package. There's also one called Future, which helps us manage parallel processing. And so if you install those, if you haven't already, you can run this install.packages line, and that'll install those libraries. But we want to go ahead and load those up. And change our working directory to the working directory for the webinar series. So if you've downloaded an archive of I guess a snapshot of the GitHub site and unzipped it into a folder, you just want to set the working directory to the root of that Spatial Data Science Webinars 2020 folder. And all the other paths are relative to that. So let's just load one of these tiles. The function here is called read LAS. And it takes a couple of seconds, and then we've got this LiDAR tile. If I just type this object name into the console, LiDAR tile, then it gives me just a really basic summary of the data set. So it tells us it's an LAS format. That's that standard format for point cloud data. It tells us it's taking up a little bit less than 80 megabytes of memory. This is not a very large file. I wanted to get something small so that it was easy to manipulate for people that didn't have a ton of space on their computers, or a ton of memory. And I'm also going to load that same study area from Structure from Motion Photogrammetry. So we've got this tile, SFM tile, which has the same spatial extent, but is derived from photogrammetry and not from LiDAR. And with that same summary, we can see that it's quite a bit denser than the LiDAR tile. It has a density of about 55 points per meter squared. All right, let's just visualize some of these. So if we plot those objects, it'll give us a give us a plot, and I think I need to rearrange my screen sharing so that I can show you that. Yep. So this is it's kind of a funny little plot, but we can manipulate the data kind of like we did in Cloud Compare. And I'm going to get out of full screen mode. I think that's what's messing with my screen sharing. And we'll just do desktop 1. There you go. All right. So if we plot that, it's going to give us another window. So this is feasible for small point clouds, but as soon as you get it up into the tens or hundreds of millions of points, it's really not going to be performant enough. And that's because it's based on the RGL package that just doesn't do some of the rendering tricks like octree sparsity or ambient occlusion that that Cloud Compare does. So works pretty well for the purpose of visualizing small point clouds or making figures, but isn't going to be great for visualizing really large data sets. Okay, so we want to classify this point cloud, and in particular, the first step of the process workflow here is to figure out where the ground is, right? And the best algorithm that is fast enough to work at really large scale for this process is an algorithm called a CSF filter, a cloud simulation filter. And I'll show you a visualization that shows what that filter is doing. So imagine taking the point cloud, flipping it upside down. So now the ground is on top of the point cloud. And imagine a simulated cloth laid down on top of the point cloud. And you can sort of imagine simulating that at a couple of different time steps as it settles on the surface. And where that point cloth, I guess where that cloth settles is a good approximation of the ground surface. Now, in this figure, you've got a cloth that is really stretchy. The simulated cloth is really stretchy, which means that it fills the holes between the points really well. So this is probably too stretchy for getting a good model of the ground surface. Luckily, that's a parameter that we can set. We can make it as stretchy or as rigid as we want. And if we choose good values, then that simulated cloth is going to fall really close to the actual elevation of the ground surface. So switching back to R, we can use that classify ground function with the algorithm CSF. The CSF algorithm has a couple of different thresholds here. The classification threshold is how close to that simulated cloth should points be before while still classified as ground. So here we're saying only pick the points as ground that are within 1 centimeter of the simulated cloth. We can pick the resolution of that cloth if it's, in this case, 0.7 meters, 70 centimeters. And we can also choose the rigidness. So we want it to be relatively rigid, just a little bit stretchy. So we can set that parameter. So if we do that, it takes a little bit of time to run through and classify those. I think they're about 8 million points. But once we do so, we can take a look at what we've got. Oops. So in this visualization, all of the ground classified points are blue, and all the non-ground points are classified as gray. So if we flip this upside down, we can see, yeah, most of the ground surface seems to be represented pretty well, and then some of these places that that have vegetation, like the willow bottomland here, don't have very many classified ground points. And of course, we don't have very many that are that are on the understory of this conifer forest, like we were like we saw before in Cloud Compare. So now what we can do is take that classified point cloud and just focus on the ground classified points, and then make a digital elevation model out of that using a function called grid terrain. So that's going to use an algorithm called a triangulated integrated network, or TIN, to triangulate between the ground classified points to come up with a continuous surface from those sparse points. So I'm going to do that and then visualize the output. All right, so here's what it looks like. And like, honestly, this looks pretty good, right? So we've got, I think, a decent representation of the ground surface with the caveat that you can see these big triangles here in the middle of the tile. And those happen when we're trying to triangulate between points that are really far away from each other. And if we don't have many understory points, then that's not going to be a very realistic representation of the ground surface underneath the canopy. So it's probably good for some purposes, but I wouldn't want to, I would probably want to try and get a better quality point cloud if I really was focused on the topography of dense forests. This SFM DEM is actually a raster object. So if I use this line of code, I can write that to a file and then open it up in a program like QGIS, just like any other raster data set. Okay, so that's DEM generation. And there's a lot of potential detail there, but I'm going to move on to the next step. And that's normalizing the cloud so that it becomes height above ground instead of height above sea level. That's the function normalize height. And you'll notice I'm just passing the point cloud in here, and I'm not passing the point cloud and the DEM. That's an option. But what's going to be more accurate is that it actually triangulates the surface, and rather than gridding it, it uses the triangulation, that mesh, as the basis to normalize the point cloud. So it's subtracting the mesh elevation from the point cloud elevation directly without going through the grid step. And that's just a little bit more accurate. But it's using the same algorithm, the TIN algorithm, to generate the ground surface. So I can just go ahead and run that. And if I plot the result, it's going to look similar to the point cloud that we saw before. But here it looks like the topography is like totally flat, which is exactly what we want, right? So now the Z coordinate is represented by height above ground instead of height above sea level, which is what we want. One thing that might not have been totally obvious from the point cloud before is that we've got more than just trees in this scene, right? So we've got trees, but we've also got cabins. There's even a weather station tower that's here somewhere. You can see the right here, this little house-looking thing is actually a house. And if we're interested in vegetation structure, we want to figure out how to take out the cabins and other non-tree things from this point cloud. And that's where really the advantages of structure from motion photogrammetry come in, because we can use the colors of the points as a pretty reliable indicator of whether they're tree or not. So the next block of code calculates a vegetation index called GCC, a green chromatic coordinate, from the red, green, and blue values associated with each point. And so here what we're doing is we're actually reaching inside of the point cloud object that has a slot called data. And so if we just look at the header of SFM norm at data, oops. This is essentially just a data frame, right? So we can use all the different tools that we already know how to use with data frames for this point cloud data. So in this case, I'm just making a new variable, GCC, that is a mathematical transformation of 3 of those other bands. So it's the ratio of the green value with the sum of the red, green, and blue values. So this is something that varies between 0 and 1. And the sort of greener point is, the higher GCC it's going to have. And then I can use that vegetation index to filter my point cloud and just pick the points that have a high enough GCC to be considered vegetation and not ground or cabin or weather station. Oops, forgot to run this line. All right, so now that I've got my normalized and filtered point cloud, I'm ready to model the canopy surface. And there I'm using a function called grid_canopy. And that's going to use a pit-free algorithm. And that's an algorithm that tends to produce cleaner canopy surfaces than just a naive approach, like say taking the highest elevation of a point within a given, I guess highest elevation point within a given raster cell. And if I run that, it's going to take a little bit of time. But after that, we've got a raster data set that represents the height of the canopy surface. So if I plot SFM CHM, then that gives me a pretty nice looking raster data set where we can see the tops of the individual trees. And we're minimizing the influence of some of the photogrammetric noise and the gaps that are induced by shadows and things like that. This is an algorithm that has quite a few dials and knobs to turn, right? So again, this is just something that we're optimizing by trial and error. But if we had a field data set of canopy heights, this might be something to use field data to optimize. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to demo is something called segmentation. So this is going to take our point cloud and divide it up into segments that represent the individual crowns. And I'm going to do that using a function called find_trees. And it has, again, quite a few knobs to turn. But if we find the trees, it's going to search through our scene and come up with local maxima, places where we've got points that are high relative to their neighbors. And those are good candidates for treetops. It's then going to take those putative treetops and then grow regions around them to encompass the points that are associated with a particular tree. So this is a visualization of what that algorithm is doing. It's one called ITC segment. The black dots here are the putative treetops, and then it's going to grow a region from those according to certain rules, and then classify all the points within the region as belonging to a particular tree. Now, there are quite a few different segmentation algorithms that we could possibly apply, and I'm not saying that this segmentation algorithm is the best or that we've necessarily optimized it. But if we use that algorithm, it's going to give us an object called SFM seg. And that's actually kind of cool because it's a polygon data set. It's going to be a polygon data set eventually. But in the meantime, this is a segmented point cloud. So each putative tree crown here is represented by a different color. And all the points that are represented that are considered to be part of that crown are that same color. And this actually looks pretty good. It seems to work really well for the big conifers, but maybe not as well for the small aspen. But kind of not pausing to optimize this too much, we can then calculate measures for individual trees. For example, this function is going to extract the height of the tree top, the standard deviation of point heights, and also the mean and standard deviation of that green chromatic coordinate, that vegetation index that we were talking about before. And we can use the delineate crowns function to sort through the point cloud and extract information on each individual and then store it in a polygon data set. So that's what crown_metrics is. We can plot that. Oops. That's a typo. It should be crown metrics, not crowns metrics. And this is going to take a little bit to plot, mostly because the plotting function is kind of slow. But you can see it's building up a map of those segmented polygons. And the color scheme here is based on the mean green chromatic coordinate for each polygon. So you could sort of imagine this as a measure potentially of tree health. So the greener something is, presumably the more leaves it has relative to branches. And so this might be a good metric to use as, for example, as a predictor of forest mortality, like in the analysis I was working you guys through before. Okay, so we're almost done. We've gone through that whole sort of core workflow. We've delineated the ground surface. We've normalized the cloud. We've come up with a model of the canopy surface. We've segmented that cloud into individual trees. And the final thing is all this has been happening on a single tile, right? But our data sets are really big, oftentimes hundreds or thousands of tiles like this. And we don't want to have to step through in a script every single tile. So the LiDAR package has a really cool facility for doing that. And it's based on what are called LAS catalogs. And what a catalog is it's just an index of LiDAR tiles, right? So in this case, we've used a function called read LAS catalog, and we've pointed it to a folder in our test data set called LiDAR tiles. That actually just has 2 files in it. There are 2 different LAS files. And it'll give us some summary information here. It tells us that it's an LAS catalog. Number of files is 2. Average points per meter square is 11. And we can plot it to get a sense of what the outlines look like. And this is not a super shocking plot. It just says it just has 2 squares. But here's where the magic happens. So you can set up LiDAR to process things not by tile, but rather by chunk. And chunks are arbitrary geometries that you can use to iterate over a given catalog. And they can be larger or smaller than a file itself. So I'm going to set some options here that tell it, let's process this in 100 meter by 100 meter chunks with an overlap of 10 meters. We put in an overlap to prevent some edge artifacts from some of the algorithms. If we set those options, and then we set some other options to overwrite the output, then we can use a lot of the same functions. Like this is that grid terrain function we were using before to build a DEM. But if we direct it to a catalog instead of a single LAS file, then it uses that catalog engine to iterate through all the chunks in a catalog and process them either in serial or in parallel. And this is really important if you've got really large files that won't fit in memory, or if you've got a ton of processor cores, say if you're working on a workstation or you're working on a cloud computing platform, say you've rented an Amazon server with 128 cores, you can set up efficient large-scale processing this way. So I'm just going to do that really fast, and it'll show you what this looks like. Right. So remember, we've got 2 files on disk. Oops. Oh wow, that totally just crashed. All right. So I'm about done. You're going to have to take my word on it. This does usually work, but it allows us to iterate through large data sets and process them in parallel in ways that we couldn't do with the code that we ran before on a single tile. And yeah, so that's the demo. And I want to emphasize that this is really just kind of scratching the surface of what's possible with that LiDAR package. And if you're interested in reading more about this, I strongly recommend this this LiDAR book. It's freely available online at that link, and has a ton of great information, worked examples, different applications, explains really well what all the functions in the package do. It's just like a model for code documentation. So I encourage you guys to go forward with that. Awesome. And I am like really close to the end of my time. So I'm going to go ahead and say we're done. Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But feel free to stick around for a few minutes if you've got a question you want to ask. And yeah, thanks so much for coming, guys. It's been fun to do this, and I hope you'll join me for the next one coming up in a month.